remotely. Can I just check, Steve, that you can hear the committee?
Just broadcast, I'll bring him in.
There you are. We can see you. Steve, can you hear us okay? We've lost you.
Yes, I can hear you okay.
Good stuff.
Morning, everybody.
Morning.
Morning.
Emma's not just quite online yet, but she'll be able to join in due course. And Declan is running a wee bit late. So we have a quorum. We'll just continue. Just to inform members, mobile devices, as always, are permitted, provided they are muted and on airplane mode. Tablets and laptops should only be used for committee business during meetings. So welcome to our third meeting of the Democratic Scrutiny Committee. Is there any apologies?
Just an apology from Joël.
Okay. So item number 2, just updating members on communication and technology updates. So can I refer members to the paper at page 5 of your pack? And that's from the Director of Parliamentary Services outlining the improvements to technology within the Assembly. Just to draw your attention in particular to the language and simultaneous interpretation arrangements that have been put in place by the Assembly Commission, which allow for simultaneous and passive interpretation of Irish and Ulster Scots spoken in Assembly proceedings. So on non-plenary days, the service can be provided at no more than one committee meeting at any one time, and it's not available to support committee business on days when the plenary is sitting. So members should therefore be aware that it may not be possible to provide the service in response to all requests. Any member wishing to have their comments in Irish or Ulster Scots interpreted during committee meetings should inform the clerk at least 5 working days in advance of the meeting for which the service has been requested and specify the relevant agenda items to which it's relevant. Witnesses wishing to have their comments in Irish or Ulster Scots interpreted during committee proceedings will be expected to inform the clerk at the time of confirming their attendance at the meeting. So, just to remind members, Standing Order 78 provides that they may speak in a language of their choice. However, when simultaneous interpretation is not provided as outlined in the guidance, a member who speaks in a language other than English must provide a full and accurate translation of their remarks. Highlight members that the only committee room with the facility is room 29. Therefore, for this committee, it would involve a room change. Are members content to note these arrangements?
Agreed.
Michael Orr. Okay, that's me translating. Declaration of interests. Just to remind members that they are obliged to declare any relevant financial or other interests. If anyone has any interest to declare, they should do so at the start of their relevant agenda item. So moving on then, moving on to draft minutes, item number 4, refer members to the draft minutes of proceeding, page 13 of the pack. Are members content that the draft minutes of meeting 22nd of February are a true reflection of proceedings? Okay, number 5, matters arising. Can I just advise members that development of the committee's engagement and education programme is going to commence next week. In the meantime, a letter has been received from the chairperson of the House of Commons European Scrutiny Committee, Sir William Cash MP, asking to meet in person to discuss respective ways of working and to explore how this committee can productively support our scrutiny. So a copy of the letter can be found on page 3 of our table pack. Are members content that the clerk takes this matter forward with a view to facilitating an informal introductory meeting at lunchtime on Thursday the 21st of March after our committee meeting has ended that day?
Chair, I would suggest, if possible, an engagement with that committee, that we should look at having a more formal meeting with the committee if they're going to visit. I just think that we're going to, as you say, hear about a programme of engagement next week, which will likely include engagement with, our European counterparts and so on as well. And this is a committee that's going to be directly involved on the London side of some of what we're going to be discussing. So I think it would be appropriate if we can facilitate a more formal sitting for Bill Cash and committee.
Go ahead, Claire.
Sorry, just to be clear, sorry, the development is going to start next week, so it'll be a couple of weeks down the line before you get the full thing. But would you envisage members of that committee sitting at the other end of this table during a formal meeting?
I think so. I would engage with that committee to see what they envisage for this. If they want it to be more casual, that's fair enough. But I think it would be appropriate for this committee to have more formal engagement with that committee.
And just to add to that, Chair, I think that obviously with the programme that's being put together, obviously that'll have engagement with European bodies, etc. That more in-depth aspect is equally applied in London with regards whether it's the Cabinet Office with direct responsibility alongside those relevant committees, just so the committee can fully embed itself with the work that's going on there in terms of its scrutiny aspect.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, there's no issue with that. Everybody happy?
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay. Item number 6, UK-EU dual divergence. So members will be aware that this is on our agenda, and before us today we have Dr Lisa Claire Whitten, Research Fellow, School of History, Anthropology, Philosophy and Politics at Queen's University, and Joël Reland, Research Associate, UK and a Changing Europe, who will be joining us remotely. Can I just check that Joël can, at the minute, see and hear the committee? Okay, so we'll just give him a wee second. Can I just...
Yeah.
There you are. Joël, can you hear and see us okay? Okay, thank you. So I'm just going to, at the outset, just let members know Joël needs to leave the meeting by 11 a.m. So can I also refer members to page 22 of the meeting pack for the relevant papers. Welcome both witnesses and invite them to brief the committee. So I'm not sure if you've arranged who's going first.
I think
Joël.
Joël might go first because he needs to leave, if that's okay.
Okay.
Joel?
Go ahead, Joël.
Morning, everyone. I assume you can hear me. So yeah, to give you a brief introduction, I'm a researcher at UK and Changing Europe, based in London, and we spend part of our time tracking regulatory divergence between the UK and the EU. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of what divergence is, how we track it, and kind of some of the main findings, specifically kind of consequences in Northern Ireland context. So in very, very simple terms, divergence is where the UK and EU's regulations differ from one another on a particular issue. And this has been made a possibility as a result of Brexit, because the UK no longer follows automatically EU regulations, at all. It has legacy regulations, but it has the freedom now to diverge if it so wishes. So the two main forms of divergence which we identify are active divergence, which is where the UK reforms or creates new regulation outside of the EU. So to give a hypothetical example, it could look to reform the GDPR regulations on data protection, which obviously were adopted as an EU member state, but it could choose to change those outside. And we also have passive divergence, which is when the EU updates or creates new regulation and the UK does not decide to follow. Again, to give an example, this time a tangible one, we have the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism, which has now come into force and obviously does not apply in the UK. There is then a kind of third element, which we call internal divergence, which reflects the fact that, particularly in the case of Northern Ireland, there's not always the same regulations being adopted across the UK. So with Northern Ireland, this is as a result of the Protocol Windsor framework, where rule changes in the UK would not necessarily apply in Northern Ireland because it must remain aligned to the EU in certain areas. And similarly, new EU regulations, which the Westminster government does not adopt, could apply in Northern Ireland, creating that difference in regulatory standards within the UK internal market. How we track it is a unscientific process, I would say. We do our best to monitor through reading EU, UK government documents, through media monitoring, and also speaking with relevant experts in areas so they can notify us of particular issues. We make no attempt to be systematic because it is more or less impossible for a government, let alone a small academic research organization, to systematically understand all forms of divergence. But we try and identify what we think are the most consequential cases. And we have 10 editions of our tracker so far, with over 250 case studies of divergence in them. So we try and identify the key implications and understand those. As for what happens within government on the UK or EU side, I wouldn't wish to comment too definitively, but I don't think there's anything much more systematic than the way in which we approach it. So then moving on to the consequences, and here I want to draw down on the Northern Irish issue because that's why we're here. So the consequences between active and passive divergence differ. In terms of active divergence, the kind of potential hindrances within the UK internal market are less. The barriers to trade are less from the UK changing its regulations because there is that government commitment to maintain Northern Ireland's unfettered access to the rest of the United Kingdom. So even if the UK government hypothetically change standards, increase its standards on food or chemicals restrictions compared to the EU, there's that commitment to maintain Northern Ireland access. And so the kind of challenges around active divergence, which I think maybe we can discuss in more detail later, are more around actually competitiveness and the idea that there might be different regulatory standards for, say, farmers in Northern Ireland compared to Great Britain, the possibilities they have and how that affects kind of their competitive kind of abilities within the UK internal market. The more consequential element so far has been passive divergence because there hasn't been much active divergence. The reasons for that are contested. I would say it's primarily because there's generally an economic cost to the UK from active divergence and it increases barriers to the EU single market, which businesses don't want. And I think that's a large reason why. But passive divergence, there has been significant development because the EU is a very active regulator. And so these continue to have implications for Northern Ireland in particular. Pre-Windsor framework, to give an example, there were restrictions on the E171 food colouring, which meant that kind of certain goods, kind of baked goods from British supermarkets, UK GB supermarkets, could no longer be exported to Northern Ireland. That has now to a large degree been addressed by the Windsor framework and the fact that a lot of food products in particular can use the green lane. However, goods must still follow EU standards when it comes to manufacturing and certain kind of food regulations as well. And so what we see, basically, there is a continued possibility of GB-NI divergence where the EU updates regulations related to manufacturing goods. And there are a number of things in the pipeline here. We've got eco-design regulations, we've got packaging regulations, we've got regulations around deforestation, which are already in effect, a regulation around forced labor in supply chains as well, which all have implications for how manufactured goods have to be produced, labeled, assessed, and potentially the new barriers to they create new barriers to exporting to Northern Ireland because producers in Great Britain would have to change their practices. And there you have a risk of goods no longer being exported across the Irish Sea because it's too costly for the GB-based producer to adapt to the new regulatory standards which apply in Northern Ireland. So that's what I see as kind of the central divergence challenge going forwards. And I will leave it there.
Okay, thank you. We're now going to ask Dr. Whitten to give her presentation. Can members then after we'll take questions if you want to indicate to the clerk, and for 2 members online if you want to indicate in the chat box if you want to ask questions. Over to you, Dr. Whitten.
Great, thank you, and thank you for the invitation to be here. I thought I would perhaps look in a little bit more detail at some of the additional complexities that we see as regards divergence in the Northern Ireland setting, and to do that I might sort of backtrack a bit and go a bit more basic, so advanced apologies if this sounds unnecessarily sort of fundamental, but I think seeing some of the complexities and contingencies of the current regulatory landscape that we have in Northern Ireland and the specifics of the Windsor framework are easier to understand and analyse when we put them in the broader context of how we got to where we are and what are the different dimensions at play. So I think that additional complexities for understanding divergence broadly in the Northern Ireland setting arise from 3 different factors. So the nature of the devolution settlement here, the nature of relations between the 2 jurisdictions on the island of Ireland, and then the nature of the post-Brexit arrangements under the Windsor framework, that coming sort of in the context of those first 2 settings. So quickly on devolution, it's just straight up to say that Northern Ireland had more devolved policy areas that were directly impacted by EU exit than was the case anywhere else in the UK. So through the Common Frameworks process, which sought to identify those areas of EU law that intersected with devolved competence, 150 areas were found in total, and of those 152, 149 intersected with devolved competence in Northern Ireland, versus 101 in Scotland and 65 in Wales. So just that this tells us that in the overall process of UK law decoupling from EU law, the devolved institutions in Northern Ireland were always going to have to manage the impact and implications across more policy areas than their counterparts in Scotland and Wales. And framing that discussion of divergence, and I think in our conversation we might come on specifically to dual divergence or trivergence as it's been called, against that backdrop of understanding the intra-UK legal and policy differentiation that comes from devolution can be useful, because it's in the conversation about divergence, really it's all a question of managing it. It isn't inherently negative, but it's a question of how it gets managed and what are the costs and benefits of any given instance or case of divergence. So just second point generally on North-South relations and cooperation, leaving aside for a second political histories on this island, but given just what the UK's EU exit entails, in general, leaving a single market for movement of goods, capital, people and services, leaving a customs code, common agricultural policy, etc., etc. In that circumstance, Northern Ireland's geographic proximity to Ireland puts it uniquely in a position of exposure to the outworkings of whatever deal was to come forward in terms of the UK-EU relationship after withdrawal. And this part of the world was always going to be the most immediate touching point between the post-EU exit respective legal orders and regulatory regimes that had effect in the UK and the EU. A specific outworking of that is in relation to just the fact that the island of Ireland is a single biographic unit, and that the EU has regulated pretty extensively in the areas concerning sanitary and phytosanitary standards, animal health, plant health, that sort of thing, and also environmental governance, which you may come back to because it's treated differently as regards the Windsor Framework provisions. So alongside pure geography, it's also the case that Northern Ireland and Ireland are even more uniquely linked than two adjacent but separate jurisdictions would otherwise be expected to be, largely due to the Strand 2 element of the 1998 agreement and the institutions and relations that represents. So similar to some extent to the pre-EU exit intersection between devolved competence in the UK and EU competence. And when we looked at North-South cooperation on the island of Ireland, the substance of that intersected with areas of EU law and policy. So in 2017, during the negotiations on withdrawal, the UK and the EU conducted a mapping exercise to find out how much North-South cooperation existed. It found 142 areas. Of those 142 areas, 96 were identified as being fully or partially underpinned by EU law or policy. Of those 96, when we read those alongside what is or isn't covered by the Windsor Framework, there's essentially a three-way split. So a third, roughly, are fully covered by the EU laws that continue to apply under the Windsor Framework, a third are partially covered, and a third aren't covered. So why does this matter? What does it mean for divergence? Again, it's a contextual point that for any discussion of dual divergence, because when we understand changes being made domestically, either at Northern Ireland level or UK-wide level, to those instruments or what is now assimilated law that previously followed from the UK's EU membership and which underpins North-South cooperation, or have a cross-border dimension, and that includes in areas of non-devolved policy, so for example immigration, that can be expected where changes are being made there to put a challenge to the continuation of the status quo on the island of Ireland or arise some level of disruption in specific sectors. And by the same measure where the EU amends or replaces North-South relevant law or law that has some degree of cross-border dimension, that can also be expected to put a challenge to the status quo, and that's part of the picture of understanding divergence and multiple forms of divergence in Northern Ireland in terms of dual or trivergence. So then to the Windsor Framework, more specifically, aspects of EU law continue to apply to Northern Ireland, and primarily in regard to free movement of goods, also state aid, electricity markets, VAT and excise, and individual rights. Those acts, there's about 330 as agreed in the text originally, and primarily most of those are listed in Annex 2 and correspond to Article 5. Any EU amendments or replacements to those acts that already apply under the terms of the Windsor Framework by default have effect in Northern Ireland. Most of those EU acts and relevant updates to them are now in the scope of Article 13.3a, which is part of the reason we're all here. And also new EU acts deemed to fall in the scope of the Windsor Framework may also be added to those which already apply in Northern Ireland under its terms, subject to agreement of the UK and the EU, with the former now committed to do so only after an applicability motion is passed in this place with cross-community consent and or exceptional circumstances apply. So taken as a whole, the Windsor Framework puts Northern Ireland by default in a relationship of dynamic regulatory alignment with certain aspects of EU single market law, primarily concerning goods. Why does this matter for divergence? Well, obviously, in areas where EU law continues to apply in Northern Ireland under the Windsor Framework, its regulatory arrangements and related legal obligations differ from those that apply elsewhere in the UK. That does not necessarily mean that the regulations do or must differ in substance, but it does mean that the terms in which Northern Ireland has to follow those EU laws are different, and the respective capacities for Northern Ireland to diverge from EU law or previous EU standards in the rest of the UK is very different. So we have a sort of standing point of divergence. So not at all an exhaustive review, but for what it's worth, I find it helpful to set out the context broadly understood for the regulatory landscape of Northern Ireland prior to understanding or getting into the weeds of any specific instance of divergence as arising from Article 13.3a or 13.4 when we're discussing cases. Very briefly, just on consequences of divergence, and essentially it's reiterating what Joel has already said. The short answer is that it's going to depend on the case. Key factors in determining what those consequences are, it'll be the policy area at play and the type of divergence, or where divergence is going to fall most sharply, either in regard to the jurisdictions within the UK, so if it's intra-UK divergence, if it's GB to NI divergence, or if it's the UK including NI and the EU including Ireland. While that catch-all contingency of consequences depending on circumstance is true, a couple of more specific points just on market access and competition. So a normal consequence of regulatory divergence between trading partners is diminished market access. This could be a corollary of divergence in the Northern Ireland context, including in the event of the Storm and Break being pulled, but that statement ought to come with some important caveats in view of the commitments that have been made, particularly on the part of the UK government, for continued unfettered market access for Northern Ireland goods to the rest of the UK market. I'm trying to make this more brief. So there are substantial commitments now in domestic law to retain unfettered access for Northern Ireland goods, under the including as amended by the most recent Safeguarding the Union deal. On the EU side, any substantive divergence, including that in the event that the Storm and Break would be pulled under Article 13.3, so we're talking about dual divergence. It's important to note that the commitment on the EU side is that if it's to an amendment or replacement act, the break will only be applied to that part of the Union Act as amended or replaced, provided that is severable. If it's not severable, then the smallest part that is severable of the EU Act will be not applied in the Northern Ireland context. So what that tells us is that in the event that the break is pulled, it won't be a wholesale divergence of disapplication of a full EU Act. It'll be not updated version and a small, like a limited form of divergence from the EU side in regard to Northern Ireland's what law applies there. At the same time, it is the EU does have the possibility of taking remedial measures in the event that if an Article 13.3a break was pulled and then that the relevant act went to the Article 13.4 process and the UK didn't agree to it being added, that gives the EU then the possibility of taking remedial measures, which could be market access. Okay. Could mean limitations on Northern Ireland market access to the EU, albeit likely to be specific to the circumstances that are already going to be narrowed to the form of the update. Okay. So dual divergence arising from the exercise of the storm break is possible, and there could be consequences for market access, but those are going to be limited, or at least it's worth holding that in the framework of continued market access, NI to GB, and the parameters of a market access limitation in the Northern Ireland to the rest of the EU setting. Hopefully that makes sense. Just to finish, one of the consequences of divergence more generally that is perhaps for consideration when weighing up costs and benefits of alignment versus divergence is just on competitiveness of Northern Ireland, and that sort of cuts both ways. On the one hand, Northern Ireland does retain full access to the rest of the UK market as well as to the EU market in respect of goods. Broadly, that situation can be expected to be beneficial for competitiveness. On the other hand, it's also true that Northern Ireland traders are going to have to continue to apply with EU standards in areas covered by the Windsor framework, which may, or given the current trajectories, we could perhaps assume will place a higher regulatory burden on Northern Ireland local producers than will or may apply to their counterparts in GB. And in this respect, the new changes around the Green Lane and the UK Internal Market Scheme Lane are perhaps significant because we do have partial disapplication of some of the Annex 2 law about 65 to those goods subject to compliance with the conditions of use of the Green or Internal Market Lane. Those goods coming across don't have to comply with all of the regulations listed in Annex 2, but Northern Ireland producers selling onto the local market, those same goods do have to comply with all of the regulations, so you do have a risk of undercutting created there, and so a challenge to competitiveness for local producers, albeit one that's narrowed to the scope of the retail goods element of the Green Lane or Internal Market Lane, and the degree of divergence in GB from those 65 EU acts in assimilated law. I'll finish with this just to say that one of the consequences of divergence in general when we look at the Northern Ireland situation as a whole is just complexity and trying to have the capacity to monitor and to track, because as we said, divergence isn't necessarily negative. If it's unmanaged or unmonitored, that's much more likely to be negative and to have to fall heavily on some people. So the complexity and the capacity challenges that brings is one of the lasting consequences of the post-Brexit divergence alignment situation in Northern Ireland. I'll finish there. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much to both of you. That was very interesting, and it was good to leave it on the subject or the point of complexity. You both talked about, Joël talked about active divergence, and he said we'd maybe talk about the challenges that would produce later on. I think we've already seen, or we've all been lobbied about the issue of organic hen producers here in the north, where they have to follow different regulations than they do in Britain. So that's, I presume, a challenge that you would point to from active divergence. And then, Dr. Whitten, you talked about the impact that it may have on the competitiveness of businesses here in the north competing, maybe who have to follow EU regulation, and businesses in Britain who don't. So that might apply a competitive issue. Have you any idea of the kind of sectors or the types of businesses that are likely to encounter that most? And in terms of Joël's point about the active divergence, if he can maybe indicate the types of businesses or sectors that is likely to impact most. So I'm going to ask Joël first.
Sure. I think, sort of as you're alluding to, agriculture stands out as an area. The most obvious example that I would point to of this risk being live is active divergence around gene editing regulations, and DEFRA is pushing ahead with liberalization of the use of gene editing for farmers. And in theory, what this allows them to do is produce crops which are they could be more pest resistant, so reduce use of pesticides. They could sort of develop crops with particular strains that sort of occupy a new niche in the market, and so they have greater value for that reason. It could be to do with the nutritional content of the food, all kinds of potential benefits coming from this gene editing technology. And if that is implemented in England before the European Union comes forward with its own reforms, because it is looking at it, although there's also a likelihood that DEFRA and the EU will regulate in slightly different ways, so there will be different permissions in terms of what you can do with gene editing, then those English farmers have access to a range of new technologies which Northern Irish farmers would not. And so if you're trying to sell whatever kind of crop, wheat or whatever, in the UK internal market, Northern Irish farmers have less kind of tools at their at their fingertips that they can use to try and gain that competitive advantage. So that is what I see as a potential risk. And agriculture, other areas, I don't know, but it's clearly it's a rapidly developing sector because of the green transition. So I think these are the kind of issues which might keep cropping up, so to speak. And then other areas, I'm not really sure. I mean, thinking about areas where a future government might look to reform, perhaps kind of planning, housing regulation. I don't know. That's a devolved competence. I don't think EU regulations would apply there. So that would then come down also. Again, this is an important secondary question, right? It's not just where EU regulation restricts what Northern Ireland's freedom of movement. It's also where Northern Ireland's own policy-making capacity might restrict how well it can align with UK regulation. Because again, to give another example, which is separate here, we have the farm payment scheme, farm subsidy scheme. Northern Ireland's implementing one. The EU is not dictating what it does there. DEFRA is implementing one in England. There's also one in Wales and Scotland. England's has been, beset by kind of difficulties as it's being iterated and implemented. Farmers concerned about not receiving enough subsidy, but at the same time, it is moving forwards. I don't know if Northern Ireland is moving forwards as sort of quickly. I must admit, I'm not across all the detail of the Northern Ireland situation, but what I could foresee is a situation where England's gets more or less up and running, implemented, normalised and stabilised more quickly than Northern Ireland, simply because they have more administrative capacity. It's a much, much bigger civil service with resource to really kind of fine tune it in a way that perhaps Northern Ireland doesn't. And so there will probably be areas in future where England will continue to implement new regulations. Northern Ireland might want to align. It might want to do something similar if it's an area of devolved competence. Again, thinking about housing or planning maybe here. But will it have the capacity to do it? Will it have the capacity to make policy and implement policy at the same pace as the other devolved governments? Because if it doesn't, which there is a significant risk of, then it might just be getting slightly kind of left behind in that race to kind of implement new, better regulation.
So I guess I would say a couple of points on competitiveness. There's one specific sort of potential effect of the green lane, internal market lane, and that's would affect agri-food producers and traders, and that's the reality that less EU regulations are going to apply on GB to NI goods moving subject to the conditions of that lane than do apply for Northern Ireland goods being made here and sold here that are in the same area. That it's worth noting that the retail goods lane in substance is essentially agri-food products. It's quite narrow, so the effect in that in terms of like the broader economy is likely to be small, but it would affect small and medium-sized businesses here who trade in agri-food. And again, it comes back to that how much the GB market and regulations have changed from previous EU standards in the relevant areas. So that's a very specific competitiveness issue. More broadly then, it sort of comes back to that sense of Northern Ireland Northern Ireland following EU standards in certain areas has competitiveness implications that are broader. Examples in this could be the immigration change in UK immigration law policy. So for the salary thresholds for spouses coming or new people seeking visas for the UK, that's due to increase to 38k, something like that. So for Northern Ireland, that just has particular implications for employers that work in a sector that they would seek to attract EU citizens to work, and the proximity of the Irish labour market is an obvious sort of outworking of that. So that's like it's a longer term competitiveness challenge.
Being a very good example.
Yes, yeah, that would be another really good example. I was also going to suggest the forced labour regulation that the EU are going to bring in, or that is still currently in process, and that would require companies to guarantee that they don't have forced labour in their supply chains, and it would be new compliance checks, and that if they a regulator, authorised authority would have to be identified here. It might be like HSE, NI or something like that, or the rights bodies, to check that companies were complying with that requirement, and in the event that they identified goods that did have forced labour in the supply chain, the company would have to remove all of those goods. And so that sort of higher regulatory burden or requirements in terms of checks and controls on goods for Northern Ireland could have a longer term competitiveness consequence, albeit again the caveat of continued access into the rest of the UK market, but nonetheless the higher costs. At the same time, in the context of devolution, it may be that Northern Ireland policymakers want to opt to align, are content to have that apply in terms of mitigating against forced labour. And also in the UK-EU relationship, it's worth noting that a couple of prominent examples, we are seeing almost like mirror dancing. So changes that are being brought forward in the EU setting, like around deforestation, around the carbon border adjustment mechanism, and then what's happening at the UK level, they're bringing in new similar provisions, and I think that may continue to happen both ways in both parties sort of and for Northern Ireland then the question is always going to be, to what extent are the two provisions different, and to what extent is there recognition of between the two markets of their value. So again, that will be competitiveness and complexity will be the key sort of factors and potential consequences there.
Okay, thank you. David?
Thanks very much, Chair. I guess some of the forced labour stuff you're talking about there, that you would imagine playing that out rationally, that the companies that are most likely to be targeted by that kind of legislation are going to be big multinational firms to some degree, and they would want to adopt their supply chains to meet the needs of the largest markets in any case, and therefore the chance that that's going to affect us disproportionately is probably unlikely. I would have thought, certainly on any great number of products. Just on the, I think whenever these issues are discussed in the public discourse, there's often the divergence, and you've touched on this already, but divergence is often portrayed uniquely in a bad, or almost entirely in a bad light when it comes to divergence from the EU, and sometimes divergence from the GB seems to be discussed as being almost more palatable. Would you agree that whenever divergence is done to reflect concerns that are raised within our economy, particularly with the importance of internal trade to our local businesses, that actually it can be beneficial in that regard? And so the prospect of not aligning with some EU laws in future can actually have a benefit in that regard, particularly as some of those concerns are likely to be raised by sectoral bodies on behalf of those who whose trade is being affected.
Thanks. So I guess just on the forced labour aspect, perhaps Joel would know in more detail, but I think I'm correct in saying that we do have UK legislation under the Modern Slavery Act for big companies to have to verify that they aren't using forced labour. I think that part of the change in the new EU Act is that it would sort of filter down to smaller sized economies or smaller sized businesses in the economy, but we've yet to see it, still in proposal and it's going through trilogue. And I take the point about the global sort of dynamics at play in terms of standards and trade more broadly. On the value of diverging and aligning, I guess in a sense it's not really for me to say as to generally what is good or bad as to which market you align. I would suggest that in almost all cases it's about the sort of practical outworkings of any given specific case. And as you say, in terms of market access and trade for Northern Ireland, it is now in a strategic position, obviously fully integrated in the UK market, but with this unique access to the EU market. And so it is that touching point where that can be really beneficial or that can cause friction depending on how it's managed and what the circumstances of the specific case are. It's very likely, just on a logical sort of reading, that there will be instances where it's good for Northern Ireland opting to align with the rest of the UK for the purposes of its trade and its benefit of its citizens, and there will be cases where it might, in the devolution setting, opt to do something a bit differently to make it work better for the economy of Northern Ireland on the island of Ireland or integrated in the UK or in the EU. I guess I would view it in quite a practical and case-specific manner, rather than a sort of general statement on whether it is good or bad to align with either market. It's going to depend on the situation, if that's okay.
Well, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I'll come in. I have the benefit of being able to bring up my latest divergence tracker in front of me to look at the forced labour issue, and I can confirm Lisa Claire is correct that it will apply much more widely, so to smaller businesses as well. And you could imagine a clothing manufacturer based in Great Britain who would maybe find the costs of adapting to the new EU regulation prohibitive and would therefore stop their exports to Northern Ireland rather than adapt, because it's a small sector of their overall UK-based market, and they say rather than incur the costs of the new forms of compliance, we're just going to cut Northern Ireland out of it because we don't. It's a small section of our overall market, and we don't want to deal with all the adaptation costs. So that is the tangible risk, and similar issues arise. I would point to the eco design regulation, the updating of the eco design regulation, and the regulation on packaging, sustainable packaging as well, which again will create similar implications around how you source sort of what your products are made of, your packaging or your manufactured goods, and also how they're labelled, how they're assessed, those kind of things. Those are very real challenges which are going to be coming down the line, as again to the benefits of or otherwise of divergence alignment. It's not my role to make a judgment call on that. That's very much down to elected officials. I would just make the point that it's important to have good systems in place so that you can make an informed judgment in each case, and that I think is the really central challenge that Stormont is going to face going forwards. We've obviously now got the promise from the UK government that all potential issues which could be triggered under Article 13.3 or 13.4 are going to be supplied to Stormont. But it's one thing to have a list of regulations. It's another thing to actually understand what those regulations mean and the impact that they're going to have on society. To do that, you can't just get a lawyer to read it once and tell you X, Y, and Z, this is what's going to happen. You probably need to consult with stakeholders as well. You need to kind of actually do some analysis. It's quite a difficult, thing to get your head around, and it's going to be getting the right systems in place is probably going to be a bit of a process of trial and error in terms of perfecting that. Having enough information coming to officials to work that out is going to be, I think, a really, really, really big challenge going forwards. And there's also probably more that Stormont could be asking the UK government to do in that context. Again, great that they're supplying you with the information of EU regulations that are coming, but also, for example, say, the EU is bringing in a new regulation on deforestation, forced labour. Is Westminster going to do something similar? It would be helpful perhaps to understand, is there UK regulation, which is perhaps 6 to 12 months behind, which is going to largely replicate this? And so is it worth, say, triggering the Stormont break if actually just within 12 months, the UK as a whole is going to be broadly aligned with what the EU is doing? Having that kind of information flow to understand the intersections between the UK and the EU is also important. So yes, great that kind of we're now understanding this EU legislation that's coming, but it can be a lot richer information environment still. And so I think that really is where kind of, the work lies.
Thank you. You finished, David?
I think the with your knowledge, sure. I think the initial example there that you have below, probably detaching it slightly from the forced labour, because I don't think there'd be many people standing up to try and defend forced labour throughout the world. But the idea of companies choosing because of costs or whatever else, or perceived barriers not to trade into Northern Ireland from GB, I think it's important. That's why it's important within the Safeguarding the Union document we have, the Intertrade UK body set up to try and address some of those concerns and make sure proactively that companies are not put off trading in Northern Ireland. Just one more, Chair, if that's okay.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I guess by focusing on, I guess this discussion focuses largely around what might happen if the Stormont break is successfully applied. And do you think within this public discourse that's happening around the Stormont break or dual divergence, so on, there's a risk that we're losing sight that actually the pulling of the Stormont break, if you will, is specifically designed to allow space for practical and agreed solutions to come forward and be identified in the subsequent months, which can, command cross-community support here and lead to a solution that will command that confidence?
I'm going to ask Joël, because I'm conscious he's going in 10 minutes.
For it.
This really is a continuation of the last point that I made, is that I think the Stormont break is part of a wider getting to grips with the reality of divergence, and then it's a constant process to be managed, both within understanding changes on the EU side and also attitudes on the UK side, and trying to sort of work through and find the best position for Northern Ireland within that. And yes, we have a tendency to focus on the break as kind of this big lever which can be pulled, but there is a much kind of deeper and wider system of processes and discussion which should be going on prior to getting that. Really is kind of the final rung on the ladder, so to speak. So I think really that it's about kind of getting the wider systems in place. I would also, there's offices in Brussels as well. You've got the Northern Ireland Executive Office, you've got the UK mission to Brussels. Work can be going on there as well on the ground before EU legislation actually becomes law, where you're understanding what's coming down the track. And so maybe MLAs can be thinking about this stuff 6-12 months before it even takes any kind of effect, so that you have a lot more time to kind of get your heads around it and understand the implications. And so I think it's much more than the break. And leave it there, really.
Anything you want to add to that, Dr. Whitten?
I guess I would just say briefly, as you identified, the intra-UK trade body is really important forum for discussing the internal implications of all of this for Northern Ireland and how it works out. At the same time, like Joel has just said around the work out in Brussels in terms of engaging directly with the EU, and in that context the Windsor Framework commitments around stakeholder engagement for Northern Ireland in the context of EU external relations. I mean, that's really privileged access that Northern Ireland has in terms of contact through this, the subgroups of the Joint Consultative Working Group, and also the Commission Work Programme being sort of specifically briefed. I know that it's sort of like small consolation to say, oh, this is privileged in broader context, but at the same time, if that new architecture can be used effectively, both within the UK and in the sort of UK-EU relationship and NI direct relationship with the European Commission, the idea, reading all of those texts, is to upstream issues so that we don't get to a point where something coming forward from the EU system is going to really negatively impact people's lives here. And so that's sort of the idea. Whether or not it works, still an open question, but yeah, that's what I would say to them.
Jonathan?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much for your presentation. Reading through the European Affairs subcommittee that you both presented at, seemed a long time ago, I'm sure, given recent developments. But obviously there was quite a bit of concern surrounding the divergence piece and its impact upon Northern Ireland, and you both are on record about going down through that in relation to the different sectoral issues that could come up. Lord Godson asked about the realistic prospect of regulatory divergence. Has your opinion changed from that committee meeting to now, given what has happened in between?
I honestly can't remember what I said in response to that question, but I just, off the top of my head, I do think we're in a situation, this hasn't been done before, this new UK-EU relationship, and how two markets of that size with that level of historic integration work together as separate regulatory actors. And so we are still in a sort of to be continued ongoing analysis as to how much regulatory divergence really does arise. I think broadly we haven't seen very significant UK active divergence in prominent areas, particularly those areas that pertain to movement of goods so therefore the Windsor Framework. And part of that is just market dynamics. I think going forward, the prospect of wholesale regulatory divergence and therefore more challenges for Northern Ireland within that context is perhaps less likely than it was when we first left at the moment of exit, for a whole series of different reasons that come to the global economy, as well as just the politics of Europe and the outworkings of conflict in Ukraine and that sort of thing. But I'm hypothesizing, and I would come back to case specific and analysis of the proposals that come in and monitoring is going to be important in any divergence to sort of predict where it goes.
No, that's fair enough, and I can come Joël on it as well, because I suppose you highlighted three distinctive areas of divergence, such as active, passive and internal. Do you believe that recent developments has changed your opinion on how impactful or the level of risk Northern Ireland is to those particular types of divergence, and which particular divergence would be more damaging to the Northern Ireland economy and something that we should be carefully considering as a committee?
Okay, I'm going to head that off by saying I'm not going to give you a definitive verdict on which form is most damaging, but they have different effects. And I think the really important thing to say is that ultimately the extent of divergence depends on political and policy decisions made in Westminster and the European Union. So they are subject to the evolution of politics and policy making over time. And, there's not much anyone can really do about that. So to give an example, the UK government, when it first sort of implemented, when Brexit, the TCA first came into effect, Boris Johnson promised quite radical, active divergence, which could have meant quite significant competitive distortions within the UK internal market around subsidies and so forth, which never came to pass for a number of reasons. We now have much less of that. It's become, effectively that pursuit of radical divergence has more or less stopped. And I would imagine that if a Labour government were elected, what we might see more of actually is pursuit of active alignment with the European Union. I expect that Labour would want to try perhaps and keep pace more with EU regulations, restrictions on chemicals, for example, changes to labour regulations, those kind of things. So in that sense, if that were to be the outcome of the next election, the consequences of not only would there be unlikely to be much active divergence, but the extent of passive divergence where the EU changes something and the UK doesn't follow would be reduced, because in more cases the UK government would be looking to move in a similar direction. But But obviously that's all uncertain. Anything really could happen politically, and 5 years from now it could be a totally different picture. So yeah, that is the fundamental kind of issue, and there's only so much we can control in that. But what you can control is how you manage it and how you monitor and how you react to it. And that's where I think there has been really meaningful change since that appearance in November, December, because we've had this new command paper, which I think really does much more explicitly than ever before acknowledge the responsibility of the government in Westminster to think about how its regulatory decisions impact the whole of the UK internal market. That's something which for a long time we've been saying is a consequence, but hasn't really been thought about in depth. So putting that onto the record, making it front and center of government policy making, is a really meaningful difference. And again, coming back to what I said before, ultimately, the most important thing is, having good systems in place to monitor and respond. And so that is a great step forwards. And hopefully, we will see as those systems get up and running, them working quite effectively.
Yeah, so that's a particular point that I want to suppose lead into my next question. I understand, Joël, if you have to leave, so Lisa,
I can flex it by a few minutes.
But the point where you mention about the command paper and the emphasis now on the UK government on how they respond. So 2 weeks ago, the word divergence entered the ether of this committee. So I suppose I would like clarity and on the record from your experience and your knowledge of what has been agreed as to the role at that stage, if that hypothetical situation happened, the role of the UK government to ensure that we don't have a situation where Northern Ireland is essentially cut adrift in both directions. Particularly on the process, I would be interested to hear your opinion on that.
Yeah, shall I
go for
carry
it.
on? Yeah, I'll make this my last answer if you don't mind. So on divergence, I'll get to your process point in a second. I think there's one point which should be made before, which is obviously sort of become a discussion point, but I don't think divergence is the most significant risk around the dynamics of UK internal market divergence and the Windsor framework and all these elements. I think it's a secondary factor. I think kind of the more potentially consequential issues would be the triggering of the Stormont break in particular, and how that would be worked through a policy and a political level. But divergence is a secondary issue where, I think, as Lisa Claire kind of explained earlier, you potentially have Northern Ireland on a legacy version of EU regulation, whilst both the EU and the rest of the UK have moved forwards onto new forms of legislation. And so the risk really is, say, for example, this was around restrictions on chemicals. The EU regulates, Stormont break triggered, the UK regulates, and so they're restricted in GB and EU, but not Northern Ireland. You have the risk of dumping. You have the risk of kind of lower quality goods or goods with now banned chemicals in other parts of Europe being allowed still into Northern Ireland. That's obviously probably not a scenario that anyone desires. But I mean, the way around that would be, I suppose, to untrigger the break in that circumstance, and for Northern Ireland to realign with EU regulation if it does more or less align with the GB regulation. But I think, and this now gets to your point about monitoring and the role of the UK government, it should be possible to head off the risk of trivergence, dual divergence before it happens. Because again, as Lisa Claire has said, there are many cases where the UK is moving in a similar direction to the EU. Often it tends to be a year or two behind. I don't know whether that's because it sees what the EU does and then moves as a consequence, or whether it's because UK policymaking is just a bit slower, a bit more kind of ground up with the fact that it's dealing with a lot of new post-Brexit responsibilities. But in many areas, the UK does end up moving in the same direction. So that could be around forced labour. It could be around eco-design, labelling of packaging regulations. All these things, the UK could move in the same direction. The important thing is that if Westminster knows that is going to happen, it tells Stormont in advance, which is, again, a point I was making before, is it should be easy enough to head off dual divergence if you say, actually, okay, the EU's coming forward to this, but we are going to be following soon behind, and therefore there's no point, using the break or trying to head off this divergence any other way, because in the relatively short term, we're going to be on the same page around this. So it just takes clear, open and honest communication. And again, the systems that are set out in Safeguarding the Union should help with that to a large degree. And again, it also just relies on, I guess, like the political will of the government of the day and its commitment to, really maintaining that
I suppose you could probably comment on from this, Lisa Claire.
Just before we bring Dr. Whitten, I just want to thank Joël for coming before us and providing evidence and taking our questions, so we really appreciate that.
Thank you, and I'm sorry I couldn't stay for longer. It was,
Just when it's getting interesting, yeah.
And before Dr. Whitten answers, can she make a definitive way forward on whether we call it divergence or dual divergence?
Yeah, I think, is it above my pay grade to make that call?
I suppose probably as we're relying on a lot on what Joel has said about, potential goodwill of the UK government to engage early conversations to head off any potential issues. I suppose what I'm trying to follow through is procedurally, Stormont Breaks applied. What is the role and response of the UK government to ensure that we don't have a situation of potential divergence or dual divergence, whatever it may be? Because I suppose that, in a sense, is where the Stormont procedures are going to really interact with the UK government as to what happens next. And I'd be keen to hear if there's any thoughts and consideration given those agreements.
Yes, I would highlight the inbuilt process of the Stormont Break notification procedures that, from a Stormont perspective, to successfully notify of the pulling of the break to the UK government, the requirements there to demonstrate engagement, prior engagement with the policy area and the relevant change. So we wouldn't be from a standing start in that sense. Like, there would already be sort of engagement on the specifics of the specific act, so either an update act or then an applicability. Let's focus on the notification process first. So the update act, there would be engagement on that already. Then in the process of notification, the UK bringing that to the EU. Thereafter, what happens next is for the UK and Stormont to decide. It's okay. I've lost my train of thought, but I think there are inbuilt processes within the Stormont Break procedure. What happens thereafter in terms of market access and impact on Northern Ireland's place within the UK internal market. The triggering of the Stormont Break doesn't impact on the existing commitments for Northern Ireland goods to continue to flow into the GB market unfettered, and or the operation of the wider commitments around the Green Lane internal market lane and reduced checks and paperwork on movements of goods GB to NI. So it's within that context that any pulling of the break would result in difference in regulatory standards in the specific area. So the divergence, again, it comes back to an earlier point that I made. In the UK system, if dual divergence happens, so Northern Ireland is different on both fronts, still within the UK context, it has privileged access regardless of regulatory difference, and there's additional guarantees have been made in amendments to the UK Internal Market Act around non-discrimination, mutual recognition of goods, and in the EU setting, in terms of like barriers to trade or consequences of dual divergence there, we can read from the text. It is unknown, it's never been done, but from the text and the commitments there, it's going to be narrow to the specific change, and any remedial measures are likely to therefore be narrow, specific, and under the Article 13.4 process, which is where you could end up having the EU taking remedial measures, there is an obligation on both parties in the UK and the EU to intensively engage in discussions on the specific matter. So that would be a procedural point as to where we sort of get to that conversation.
Because you've actually come on to the point you mentioned in your initial presentation about severability in relation to, could you think you have just done that, but could you maybe simplify that from the committee's understanding? Because obviously, you know, there's a narrative as to what would happen to the specific EU law if Stormont Break was pulled, but I'm very clear to outline what is exactly the case.
Yeah, I guess maybe should have prepped, could do a detailed example more in writing, but to take so an Article 13.3a potential hypothetical case upcoming is about packaging and packaging waste. So an existing directive that's from 94 is due to be updated to a regulation, I believe, that would repeal the existing directive. So that's an act that applies to Northern Ireland under Annex 2, so it's at least at the first reading in scope of the Article 13.3a storm and break. So if that break was pulled for that act, based on the commitments, the specific act, so the new regulation would come in and repeal the existing directive, but in the Northern Ireland context, the new regulation wouldn't apply, the existing directive would continue to apply, okay? So in terms of severability and the substance of divergence, you'd want to read the new regulation alongside the existing directive and see the extent of difference, and that's what you're sort of talking about. I would have to come up with a better example.
That's fair enough. And just my final question, Chair, is you talked about competitiveness and it being an issue, particularly whenever I looked at the House of Lords subcommittee, there was the talk of procedural divergence in terms of the friction that may place as opposed to actually the divergence piece. You mentioned about particular competitiveness issues for, so for example, internal market lane, GB, NI, that has been removed. NI, GB, in terms of those accessing that lane, you still talk about competitiveness issues? Or did I pick that up right?
Not
Okay.
NIGB so much, and Safeguarding the Union has also reiterated commitments around unfettered access and removal of export declarations checks or any possibility of that on the NI to GB element. So on competitiveness, it's more about looking at the standards that apply for goods that are moving GB to NI, what standards apply to those GB goods, and NI goods going NI to NI. There is also, I guess you could make a broader sort of point around Northern Ireland's input into the UK internal market GB, and also this is maybe a more of a niche point, but in terms of the UK's trade policy and UK exports more generally, if we do understand that in at least certain areas Northern Ireland is following EU regulations that are more burdensome in a regulatory sense than apply in the rest of the UK, then you would have to note the potential for competitive disadvantage if Northern Ireland producers who are seeking to export alongside other UK producers are doing so in the context of having to follow higher regulations.
So that would be a key concern for the committee when assessing whether or not those issues of divergence come, because obviously bureaucracy would be a key part of that competitiveness issue. Yeah, thank you, Chair.
Audrey?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Are there any examples internationally, either between countries, within countries and territories, where anything similar to this has happened before that we can potentially learn from as a case study, particularly in terms of private sector response and impact, competitivity issues and stuff like that?
I'm going to answer the question and dodge the question in that I would suggest a colleague, Professor David Finnemore at Queen's, has done more specific work on association agreements and for territories, so EEA states and EFTA is often looked to, but there are also situations of sort of smaller and micro states, Andorra, San Marino, Liechtenstein, that sort of thing, and there's been some engagement with them to talk through specifically around, it perhaps comes back a little bit to procedural points, but engagement and stakeholder engagement arrangements and how within those smaller territories what systems are at play and who runs them, operates them in terms of officials and public-private sector to engage on specific issues. So there, I think I would suggest there are lessons to be learned based on my understanding, but I'm not the direct expert on that. But you might be fruitful to reach out, because there
Am
could
I-
be lessons.
Am I right in
learned.
thinking we have an invite to
Well, I
Professor
think he
Finnemore?
was included in the invite list for today and dodged it because he said that the two experts we had would cover it, but it may be worth speaking to the clerk in terms of.
Can I make a proposal that we write to him with that question possibly and seek a response rather than bringing him in here? If he wants to come, of course, would be welcome to. But
that's a much better solution.
yeah.
Brief to death.
Okay, so there's no other member has indicated. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, because I didn't realise I did have one final question, because in the House of Lords committee report, you all had mentioned your concerns surrounding the database in which you can access and track and monitor divergence. There's a particular point raised by Lord MP. We have a concern as a committee as well. I suppose our primary concern enumerates, if you look at some of the Lords Committee's reports, there's a huge delay in relation to response from UKG on some of these very particular issues mentioned by the chair about the organic eggs particular example. In your opinion, is there a better way of doing this, and should the committee be actively pursuing those sort of aspects? Because there's a talk in the committee report about the Northern Ireland system of governance not actually being able to withstand the huge amount of information and access to the relevant documents that is needed. Have you any comments to make on that?
I guess I would speak broadly on tracking divergence, because I've spent an embarrassing amount of time doing that sort of thing over the last while, and it is a challenge. The systems that we currently have could be improved, and I think particularly there's a challenge around coordination and transparency in the UK setting as to what tracking is being done, where it's being done, and who it's being reported to. I know that there's been a really concerted effort and very effective effort in the Northern Ireland system in terms of the Brussels office to set up a new system for notification, ULETs, and that sort of thing. That's positive, but I guess that's not the... it's harder to upstream to do the sort of softer engagement that can be effective means of understanding what's coming down the line. One of the challenges that we see in general, and I understand and have sympathy with the UK position in this regard, or the UK government position about not having a database, like a database, is that divergence it covers a whole spectrum of different issues, and so to have a database is perhaps it may have to be reductive to the point of being less useful than it could be, and so perhaps from their view departmental tracking is more important. And it is very notable what we've had in terms of commitments, as has been said, around safeguarding the union paper, the recognition of having to factor in the Northern Ireland implications of UK-wide policy making. In terms of the work of this committee, I would say that the storm and break divergence consequences, it's a little bit more, you can put parameters on that, because particularly on the 13.3a aspect, we know what acts are in that, in the scope of that. It's Annex 2, subheadings 1 and 7 to 47, and how those acts have changed subsequent to the initiation of the storm and break. So that sort of tracking is more possible, at least at where to start. But what then comes with that, and we've done quite a bit of work in Queen's to look at what is or isn't changing under the annexes of the protocol, now Windsor framework, at the EU side. But what's important for divergence and understanding the fuller picture is in any given instance of change that's happening at the EU, so passive divergence, as Joel was setting out, is what is also happening in the UK setting. So you look at the retained or assimilated law version of whatever EU Act is applicable under the Windsor framework, and look at what's happening in the different jurisdictions in GB, and that gives you more of a picture of the UK dynamic of it. And I guess to not have one single system, either you would have to have everybody involved and everybody feeding into it, or it's going to be partial. I think more could be done, and I think more ought to be done. And that's a personal opinion, but
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much for coming along and presenting to us. That was very useful and interesting.
very much.
So, thank you. So just moving then to the next item of business, correspondence. So there is one item of correspondence, and it's on page 5 of the table pack. It's a response from the Minister for the Economy to the letter on the 16th of February, in which I outlined the functions of the committee and how we intend to carry out our business. So the Minister is alerting us to the potential for a high volume of applicable EU legislation, including in areas of wider interest to his department, which are wholly or partially reserved, or which cut across the statutory responsibilities of multiple civil servants departments. And he does highlight that this could make it highly challenging for his officials to provide comprehensive advice in a very tight time frame, just essentially what we've been discussing here, especially if the request for advice relates to areas outside of the direct responsibility of the department. So I don't think there's any surprise in that. Our members can attempt to note the correspondence for now, and that we will return to it should any issues arise.
I think just to say, Chair, that recognise, as we all do, the challenges there, and not zoning in on this particular minister, but it is a challenge that the executive as a whole will have to meet for this committee and the Assembly to fulfil its role. So I understand the challenges, but it's not a reason not to fulfil the challenges.
Absolutely. Number 8, any other business? Do members have any other business? No. Okay. Date, time and place of next meeting. Just our next meeting is next Thursday, 7th of March 2024 at 10 a.m, room 30. During the meeting. Thank you all for coming. Just wait a couple of seconds, or no, go ahead. Just in terms of going private.